The alarms had not even finished ringing when I felt the floor tremble beneath my feet, and I knew something was wrong before anyone said a word. I am Velthara Nisiskar, daughter of the Ithrian Compact, and I had come to the human station expecting ceremony, not chaos. My escorts froze mid-step. My translator device buzzed with confusion as 3 different voices spoke over each other in the human tongue, and in the middle of that noise stood a man in a plain gray jacket holding a cup that smelled faintly of burnt bean water, looking as calm as if nothing at all was happening. I had been told this meeting would decide the future of 2 peoples. I had been told I would meet generals, war heroes, perhaps even the human head of state. Instead, the first person I was introduced to was this unremarkable man, standing near the edge of the room, saying almost nothing. "This is Daniel Hale," the human liaison said, gesturing toward him the way one might gesture toward a piece of furniture. "He will be present during the summit." I studied him for a moment. He did not wear a uniform. He carried no weapon. His hair was neither perfectly groomed nor unkempt, simply ordinary. If I had passed him in a market on my own homeworld, I would not have looked at him twice. "A translator, perhaps?" I asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. "No," the liaison said, and something in her voice made me look at her more closely. There was a strange tightness in her jaw, the kind my own guards wore when they stood before someone far more important than themselves. "He is simply here." I did not understand what that meant. I still do not think I fully understood it, not then. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and 3 human fleet admirals entered. I recognized their rank insignia from the intelligence briefings my advisors had prepared for me. Fleet Admiral Louise Carrington, Vice Admiral Peter Doyle, Rear Admiral Grace Whitfield. These were not minor officers. These were the commanders of entire battle groups, women and men who had spent decades earning the authority they now carried. I expected them to greet me first. I was, after all, the reason this summit existed. My father had sent me to represent the Compact, to decide whether humanity could be trusted as an ally or whether they should remain, as many of my court believed, a species too unpredictable to stand beside. Instead, all 3 admirals turned toward the man in the gray jacket. And they saluted him. Not a nod, not a polite greeting, a full, formal salute. The kind I had only seen humans give to their highest-ranking officers, performed with a precision that suggested this was not the first time, nor would it be the last. I stood there, uncertain whether I had misunderstood some cultural custom, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. It did not come. Daniel Hale gave a small nod in return, almost embarrassed by the gesture, and said something quiet that made Admiral Carrington's shoulders relax slightly. Then, and only then, did the admirals turn to greet me with the same formality they had shown him. "Princess Velthara," Admiral Carrington said, bowing her head in the manner my staff had taught the humans beforehand. "Welcome aboard the Meridian Station. It is an honor." I returned the greeting on instinct, my mind still caught on what I had just witnessed. 3 of the most powerful military officers in human space had saluted a man wearing no uniform, carrying no visible authority, before they had acknowledged the arrival of a foreign princess whose approval could determine the fate of an alliance between 2 civilizations. I glanced toward my aide, Sil Korath, who stood just behind my shoulder. His expression mirrored my own confusion, though he was better at hiding it than I was. The summit began as expected. There were introductions, formalities, the exchange of gifts meant to symbolize goodwill between our peoples. I offered a crystal grown in the deep caves of my homeworld, a stone that changes color with the mood of the room it sits in. Admiral Carrington offered a small flag that had flown on the first human ship to leave their solar system, folded with a reverence that told me it meant more to them than its size suggested. Throughout all of this, Daniel Hale said almost nothing. He sat near the back of the room, not at the head table where I would have expected someone of importance to sit, but off to the side, where a minor aide or a translator might sit. He drank his burnt bean water, He watched the proceedings with the mild interest of someone attending a meeting that did not particularly concern him. And yet, every so often, I noticed the Admiral's glance toward him, small quick looks, as if checking that he approved of what was being said. Once, when Vice Admiral Doyle began to describe the strength of the human fleet in perhaps too boastful a manner, I saw Daniel Hale shift slightly in his seat, and Doyle's tone changed almost immediately, becoming more measured, more careful. No one had spoken a word to correct him. No signal had passed between them that I could detect, and yet the correction had happened all the same. I began to wonder if I was imagining patterns where none existed. It would not be the first time nerves had made me see meaning in meaningless things. I had studied humans for years before this summit, reading every report my father's intelligence network could gather, and nothing in those reports had mentioned a man named Daniel Hale. When the first session ended and we broke for what the humans called a recess, I found myself walking the same corridor as him, quite by accident, or so I told myself. "Your world's crystal is beautiful," he said, before I could decide whether to speak first. His voice was quiet, unremarkable, much like everything else about him. I have never seen anything like it change color that way. "Thank you," I said, and then, because curiosity has always been my greatest weakness, I asked, "May I ask what role you serve here, Mr. Hale? I confess I have not been able to place it." He smiled, and there was something tired in that smile, something that did not match the youth in his face. "I am not sure there is an easy way to explain it, Princess. I am not military. I hold no political office. I suppose the simplest answer is that I am here because the admirals wanted me here." "They saluted you," I said, unable to stop myself, "before they greeted me." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly, I almost missed it. Not pride. If anything, it looked closer to discomfort. "Old habits," he said. "I apologize if it seemed like a slight against you. It was not meant as one." Before I could press further, Admiral Whitfield appeared at the end of the corridor and called his name, and he excused himself with a small bow that seemed almost too polite for a man who apparently outranked no one and everyone at the same time. I stood alone in that corridor for a long moment, turning the encounter over in my mind. "Old habits," he had said, "but habits come from somewhere. They are built through repetition, through years of practice, through the kind of respect that does not simply appear because someone wills it into existence." Sil Korath found me still standing there a few minutes later. "You look troubled, Your Highness," he said. "I am troubled," I admitted. "There is something happening in this station that I do not understand, and I do not like not understanding things, Sil." "Perhaps it is nothing," he offered, though his tone suggested he did not believe that any more than I did. I thought of the way 3 battle-hardened admirals had straightened their spines and lifted their hands in salute for a man who drank burnt bean water and apologized for the attention. I thought of the flicker of discomfort on his face when I had asked him directly what he was. "No," I said, "it is not nothing, and I intend to find out exactly what it is before this summit concludes." Sil nodded, already reaching for the small device he used to record observations for my father's court. "Where would you like to begin?" I looked back down the empty corridor, toward the door through which Daniel Hale had disappeared, with the admiral who commanded fleets, larger than entire worlds in my own compact. "I want to know everything there is to know about that man," I said. "And I have a feeling it will not be easy to find." I did not yet realize how right I was, nor did I understand that the answer, when it finally came, would change the way I saw not only this single unremarkable human, but his entire species. The recess ended, and we returned to the summit chamber, but my attention was no longer fully on the negotiations before me. Every time Daniel Hale shifted in his seat, every time an admiral's eyes flicked toward him, I catalogued it, storing each small detail away, like a hunter gathering evidence of a creature she has not yet seen clearly enough to name. Something old lived beneath the surface of this station, something the humans carried with a weight I was only beginning to sense, and whatever it was It was tied, inexplicably, to the quiet man in the gray jacket who apologized for being saluted. The station's records office was smaller than I expected, tucked behind a set of doors that required 3 separate clearances to open. Sil Korath had used every diplomatic privilege afforded to us to gain access, and even then, the human archivist who greeted us seemed uncertain whether she was allowed to help. "I am looking for information on a man named Daniel Hale," I told her, keeping my voice light, as if this were a matter of simple curiosity rather than something that had kept me awake through the station's artificial night cycle. "He was present during our first session today." The archivist's fingers paused over her console. It was brief, barely a heartbeat, but I had spent my entire life reading the small tales of people who did not wish to answer a question honestly. "I can search our public personnel records," she said carefully, "though I should tell you now, Princess, that not everything on this station is listed there." "I understand. Please, search what you can." She typed his name. The console hummed. A single entry appeared, and even from where I stood, I could see it was sparse, in a way that seemed almost deliberate. A birth date, a place of origin, a small town I had never heard of. No military service record. No academic credentials, no listed occupation beyond a single word. Consultant. "Consultant," I repeated. "Consultant to whom?" "It does not say," the archivist replied, and there was something almost apologetic in her tone, as though she wished she had a better answer to give me. Sil leaned closer to study the screen himself. "This is either the record of a man who has done nothing of note in his entire life," he murmured in our own tongue, low enough that the archivist would not understand, "or the record of a man whose true history has been deliberately removed." I suspected the second, though I could not yet say why with any certainty beyond instinct. "Is there anyone who might know more?" I asked the archivist. "Someone who has served with the admirals for a long time, perhaps. Someone who might remember him from before his current position, whatever that position is?" She hesitated again, and this time she lowered her voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "There is a retired officer who still lives on the station, in the residential ring. Walter Briggs. He served under Admiral Carrington's predecessor. If anyone remembers the earlier years, it would be him. But Princess, I would advise caution. Some questions on this station are not meant to be asked by outsiders, however well-intentioned." I thanked her for her help, and left before she could see how much that warning had only deepened my curiosity, rather than dampened it. Over the following 2 days, as the summit continued through its formal sessions, I made a quiet study of Daniel Hale, watching him the way one watches an animal in an unfamiliar forest, careful not to disturb the behavior I was trying to understand. He ate alone in the station's dining hall each morning, always at the same small table near the window, always finishing his meal before most others had begun theirs. When a young officer once spilled a tray of food directly in front of him, he was the one who knelt to help gather the fallen dishes, ignoring the officer's mortified apologies, treating the moment with more patience than I had seen him show toward anyone of higher standing. He was polite to the custodial staff in a way that seemed instinctive rather than performed, remembering the names of people whose work most officers on the station walked past without seeing at all. I watched him thank a maintenance worker for repairing a broken door panel with the same sincerity he had shown Admiral Carrington during our formal introduction. And yet, for all his quiet humility, strange things happened around him that I could not explain through ordinary courtesy alone. Security personnel, I noticed, adjusted their patrol routes without visible instruction whenever he moved through certain corridors, as though some unspoken protocol shifted the moment he stepped into a space. Officers who were mid-conversation would pause, not out of rudeness, but out of something closer to reflex, when he passed within earshot, waiting until he was gone before continuing whatever they had been discussing. On the second evening, I found an excuse to visit the residential ring myself, telling my escort I wished to observe the station's civilian quarters as part of my cultural assessment of humanity. It was not entirely a lie. I did wish to understand humanity better. I simply had a very specific human in mind. Walter Briggs answered his door slowly, leaning on a cane that seemed more habit than necessity, his eyes sharp despite the lines that time had carved into his face. "A princess in my doorway," he said, not quite masking his surprise. "I confess, I did not expect that when I woke this morning." "I apologize for the intrusion," I said, and meant it. "I am told you might be able to answer some questions about a man named Daniel Hale." Something shifted in his expression at the sound of that name, something guarded and careful, the way a person's face changes when asked about an old wound that has never fully healed. "You should come in," he said, after a long pause. "This is not a conversation to have standing in a hallway." His quarters were simple, filled with old photographs and small mementos of a life spent in service. He gestured for me to sit, and lowered himself slowly into a chair across from me, his cane resting against his knee. "What do you want to know, Princess?" "Why do the admirals salute him?" I asked, deciding directness was the fastest path to truth. "He wears no uniform, he holds no listed rank, and yet 3 of your fleet's most senior officers treated him with more immediate reverence than they showed me, and I represent an entire civilization at this summit." Walter Briggs was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward one of the photographs on his wall, an image of a much younger version of himself standing beside several other officers I did not recognize. "That is not a simple story," he said finally, "and it is not entirely mine to tell in full, but I can give you the shape of it if you are willing to listen." "I am." "There was a time," he began, "not so long ago, in the span of history, when humanity nearly lost everything. I will not give you every detail, because some of it is not mine to share with someone outside our own people, but I will tell you this much. Our command structure failed us, Princess. Not our soldiers, not our ships, but the people at the very top, the ones who were supposed to make the hardest decisions when it mattered most. They hesitated. They argued over authority, while an enemy fleet closed in on a system we could not afford to lose. Thousands died in the time it took our leaders to agree on who had the right to give the order to respond." I said nothing, sensing that interrupting him now would close a door that might never open again. "After that," he continued, "there were many changes to how we organize our military, but one change mattered more than all the others combined. We created a position that exists outside of rank, outside of politics, outside of ambition, as much as any human institution can exist outside of ambition. A single person, chosen carefully, deliberately, who holds the authority to cut through all of that hesitation in a true emergency. Someone every officer swears to obey, without question, the moment a crisis is declared, so that we are never again frozen by argument while people are dying. And Daniel Hale holds this position now," I said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape in my mind even as new questions bloomed alongside it. "He does. But he seems so—" I searched for the right word, unwilling to sound insulting. "Ordinary." Walter Briggs smiled, though there was little humor in it. "That is rather the point, Princess. We learned, after everything we lost, that power given to people who crave it tends to be used poorly, sooner or later. So the ones who choose the next person to hold this role look for someone who does not want it. Someone humble, someone who would rather eat breakfast alone than sit at the head of a table. It is not a reward, it is a burden we ask someone ordinary to carry, precisely because they are ordinary, because they have nothing to gain from misusing it." I sat with that for a long moment, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet man who apologized for being saluted with the weight of what Walter Briggs was describing. "What is it called?" I asked. "This position?" "We call it the Keeper," he said. "Though most who hold it never use the title themselves, Daniel would likely tell you it is simply a job if you asked him directly. He has always been uncomfortable with what it means to others, even after all this time. How long has he held it?" "Longer than most," Walter Briggs said, and something in his voice told me there was more to that answer than he was willing to give me tonight. long enough that some of us worry about what happens when the time comes to choose the next one. I wanted to ask 100 more questions, but I could see the fatigue settling into the old officer's shoulders, and I did not wish to take advantage of a kindness he had not been obligated to offer me at all. "Thank you," I said instead, rising from my seat. "You have given me more understanding tonight than 3 days of formal briefings. Be careful with that understanding, Princess," he said as I reached his door. "Some knowledge changes how you see people, and not always in ways you expect. I suspect you have not yet seen the whole of what Daniel Hale is capable of. Words can only tell you so much about a man like him. It is what he does when everything falls apart that shows you who he truly is." I did not fully understand what he meant by that until the very next day, when an alarm tore through the station and I watched, for the first time, exactly what happened when the keeper stopped being quiet. The alarm did not sound the way I expected an emergency alarm to sound. There was no wailing siren, no flashing crimson light filling the corridors. Instead, a calm voice repeated a short phrase over the station's communication system, over and over, in a tone so measured it almost made the words more frightening than a scream would have been. "Reactor failure. Escort vessel Halcyon Wing. All available personnel to stations." I was in the observation lounge when it happened, sharing a quiet cup of tea with Sil Korath while we reviewed the notes he had taken during Walter Briggs's account the night before. The Halcyon Wing, I knew, was one of the Compact's own vessels, sent along as part of the Joint Fleet exercise scheduled for that morning, a display of cooperation meant to show both our peoples working in harmony ahead of the summit's final negotiations. Sil was on his feet before I had even fully processed the announcement. "Princess, that is one of our ships." I did not need him to tell me that. I was already moving toward the observation window that looked out over the docking bay and the open space beyond it, where I could see, even from this distance, a faint but growing plume of vented gas escaping from the side of a small silver vessel drifting further from the station with every passing second. "How many aboard?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. 43, Sil said, reading from the manifest that had appeared on his handheld device, including 6 engineering cadets on their first deployment. 43 lives, drifting in a ship whose reactor was failing, in the middle of a fleet exercise meant to demonstrate trust between our species. I felt my stomach tighten with a fear I rarely allowed myself to show in public. Around me, the station seemed to hold its breath. Human officers moved quickly, but without panic, converging on stations and consoles, their voices clipped and professional even as I could see the tension in their shoulders. I searched the growing crowd for any sign of the admirals, expecting to see Carrington or Doyle taking charge of the response. Instead, I saw Daniel Hale. He was not running. He did not shout. He walked, quickly but calmly, toward the central command platform that overlooked the docking bay, and as he moved, something remarkable happened around him. Officers who had been arguing over evacuation protocols fell silent and turned toward him. A technician, who had been fumbling with a communications panel, stepped back without being asked, offering him the console as though it had always been meant for him. "Status," Daniel said, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the command platform with a clarity that cut through every other sound in the room. "Reactor containment is failing, sir," a young officer reported, her hands trembling slightly over her console. "Estimated 11 minutes before catastrophic breach. The crew is attempting an emergency reactor shutdown, but the ship's automated systems are not responding to their commands. We believe damage to the primary control relay is preventing manual override." "Compact vessel," Daniel said, turning slightly toward Sil Korath, who had followed me onto the edge of the platform, close enough to hear everything unfolding. "Do we have their engineering specifications on file from the joint exercise briefing?" "We do," Sil said, surprised to be addressed directly, and quickly transmitted the data from his handheld device to the nearest console. Daniel studied the schematic for only a few seconds, his eyes moving across it with a focus that reminded me, absurdly, of the way my own father studied battle reports before making a decision that could not be unmade. Their reactor design uses a secondary coolant loop we do not have on our own ships, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. But the failure pattern looks similar to what we saw on the Ardent Line 3 years ago. Get me a channel to every vessel within 200 kilometers of the Halcyon Wing. All of them, civilian and military both. Sir, that is nearly 30 separate vessels, the young officer said. It will take several minutes to establish individual channels. Then use the emergency broadcast frequency, Daniel said, without a hint of frustration in his voice, only calm certainty. Every ship out there is required to monitor it. Open it now. The officer's fingers moved across her console, and a moment later, a soft chime indicated the channel was live. Daniel leaned toward the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that made the fear coiled in my chest loosen, just slightly, despite everything. This is Daniel Hale, speaking on emergency authority. The Halcyon Wing is experiencing reactor failure and cannot self-correct. I need every vessel currently within 200 kilometers to reroute immediately according to the formation I am about to transmit. This is not a request. Lives depend on your response time. Acknowledge and comply. He nodded toward the young officer, who transmitted a formation pattern that appeared on the main display before us, a complex web of intersecting paths that would bring nearly 30 ships, patrol boats and cargo haulers, and a single capital ship into a coordinated rescue configuration around the drifting Halcyon Wing. What happened next was something I will never fully be able to describe to my father's court, no matter how many times I attempt to put it into words. Every single vessel responded. There was no hesitation that I could detect, no argument over jurisdiction, no captain questioning why a man with no visible rank was giving them orders across an open emergency channel. Ships that had been performing entirely unrelated exercises changed course within seconds. A cargo hauler that should have had no reason to comply with a military emergency broadcast altered its trajectory as smoothly as if it had been waiting for exactly this instruction its entire journey. "Ma'am," I heard one of my own compact officers say quietly behind me, watching the same display, "I have never seen a fleet respond to a single voice that quickly, not even our own." I said nothing, because I could not find words that matched the strange mixture of awe and unease rising in my chest. On the display, the capital ship, a vessel I recognized from the earlier briefings as the Sentinel's Watch, began extending a series of emergency tow cables toward the Halcyon Wing's position, while two smaller patrol vessels moved into position to begin evacuating the crew through emergency transfer tubes. "Sir, the Halcyon Wing's crew reports they cannot open their emergency evacuation hatches," the young officer said, her voice tightening with new urgency. "The failure has damaged the hatch control systems along with the reactor relay." For the first time since the crisis began, I saw something shift in Daniel Hale's expression, not panic, but a deepening of focus, as though he had just been handed a puzzle with far less time to solve than he needed. "Get me the Halcyon Wing's chief engineer directly," he said. A moment later, a voice crackled through the speakers, breathless and strained, speaking in accented but understandable human words, the voice of one of my own people struggling to keep calm in the face of very real death. "This is Chief Engineer Tel Merrick, Halcyon Wing. Our hatches are sealed, and we cannot override them manually. Reactor breach in approximately 7 minutes. We have 6 cadets who have never faced anything like this before, and I do not know how to keep them calm much longer." I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides. "Chief Engineer Merrick," Daniel said, and something in his tone changed, softening slightly, though it lost none of its steadiness. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to die on that ship today. I need you to trust me on that, and I need you to walk your cadets through a very specific procedure, exactly as I describe it, even if part of it does not make immediate sense to you. I am listening, Merrick said, and I could hear, even through the strain in his voice, something shifting, some small measure of hope taking root in the face of Daniel's certainty. Daniel guided him through a manual bypass sequence that drew on both human and compact engineering principles, a solution that seemed to exist somewhere in the overlap between our two species' technologies, a place I doubted many people, human or otherwise, would have thought to look under this kind of pressure. The minutes stretched unbearably as Merrick worked, his voice growing quieter with concentration, occasionally punctuated by the frightened murmur of young cadets in the background, trying, and mostly failing, to hide their fear. "Hatch controls responding," Merrick said finally, his voice cracking with relief. "We have manual override, beginning evacuation now." On the display, I watched as small figures, difficult to see clearly at this distance, but unmistakably real, unmistakably alive, began moving through the transfer tubes that the patrol vessels had extended toward the failing ship. "Reactor breach in 90 seconds, the young officer reported, her eyes fixed on the countdown. "Evacuation status," Daniel said, his voice betraying no fear despite the numbers ticking down on the screen before us. 39 of 43 crew transferred, Merrick reported. "Working on the last 4 now. They are the cadets, sir. They are frightened and moving slowly." "Tell them I am here," Daniel said. "Tell them someone is watching every second of this, and no one is leaving them behind." I do not know why those particular words affected me the way they did, but something in the simple honesty of them, the complete absence of grand promises or false reassurance, settled something in my chest, even as the countdown continued its relentless march toward zero. 42 of 43, Merrick said. "One cadet remains. She is stuck, her safety harness caught on damaged framework near the hatch." 60 seconds, the young officer said, and I heard the tremor in her voice this time, the professional calm finally beginning to crack under the weight of what was about to happen. "Merrick, get yourself out," Daniel said. "Now." "I am not leaving her, sir." "I did not ask you to leave her," Daniel said, his voice sharpening for the first time since the crisis had begun, cutting through the panic with something that demanded to be obeyed. "I ordered you to get yourselves both out. There is a difference. Cut the harness if you have to. You have a blade on your engineering kit. Use it now." A frantic few seconds passed, filled with nothing but static and the sound of ragged breathing over the open channel. "She is free," Merrick gasped. "We are clear. We are clear. Moving through the transfer tube now." 30 seconds, the young officer said. The final figures on the display moved with agonizing slowness through the transfer tube, and I found myself holding a breath I did not remember taking, watching 2 small shapes cross the gap between a dying ship and safety with a speed that felt impossibly slow against the countdown ticking toward zero. "Transfer complete," Merrick's voice finally confirmed, ragged with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "All crew accounted for. We are clear of the Halcyon wing." 15 seconds later, the ship's reactor breached, a silent bloom of light against the darkness of space, visible even through the observation window, close enough that I felt an instinctive urge to flinch away from it despite the safety of the station's reinforced viewport between myself and the destruction. 43 lives, every single one of them saved, in the final moments before a ship that had carried them became nothing more than expanding debris. The command platform was silent for a long moment after the confirmation came through, the tension that had filled the room slowly beginning to release, officers exhaling breaths they had been holding, hands unclenching from consoles they had been gripping without realizing it. Daniel Hale stood very still, watching the debris field on the display with an expression I could not fully read, something between relief and a weariness that seemed to settle into his shoulders all at once, as though the calm certainty he had carried through the entire crisis had been costing him something the entire time, something he was only now allowing himself to feel. "Good work," he said quietly, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. All of you. Good work." Then, without any further ceremony, without accepting the praise that several officers seemed eager to offer him, he stepped back from the console and made his way toward the edge of the platform, toward the exit, moving like a man who wished very much to be alone with whatever he was feeling. I intercepted him before he reached the door. "Mr. Hale," I said, and he stopped, turning toward me with an expression that had already smoothed itself back into the quiet, unremarkable calm I had first encountered 3 days ago, as though the man who had just commanded an entire fleet into a rescue operation with nothing but his voice had already tucked himself away somewhere I could not reach. "Princess Velthara," he said, "I am glad your people are safe." "You commanded nearly 30 vessels," I said, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. "Civilian and military both, human and compact, with a single order over an open channel, and every single one of them obeyed instantly. I have never seen anything like it in my entire life. I need to understand what gives you that authority, Mr. Hale. I need to understand what you truly are, because I do not believe consultant is an honest answer, and I do not believe I can return to my father's court without one." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his eyes told me he had been expecting this question for days, perhaps since the very moment I had first looked at him with confusion in the summit chamber. "That is a fair thing to ask," he said finally. "And you deserve a real answer, Princess. But it is not a short one, and it is not mine to give you carelessly, in a corridor, moments after nearly losing 43 lives." He glanced toward the observation window, toward the fading light of the debris field beyond it. "Give me until tomorrow. I will tell you everything you wish to know. I only ask that you understand, once you know it, there will be no way to unknow it." I thought of Walter Briggs's warning from the night before, the way he had told me that some knowledge changes how you see people, and not always in ways you expect. "I understand," I said. "Tomorrow, then." He nodded once, and walked away, leaving me standing at the edge of the command platform, watching the last traces of light fade from where the halcyon wing had been, and wondering exactly what kind of truth I had just agreed to carry. I did not sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the small figures moving through the transfer tube, the countdown ticking towards 0, the calm certainty in Daniel Hale's voice as he told a frightened engineer that no one was leaving anyone behind. I kept turning over Walter Briggs's words as well, the warning that had followed me since our conversation in his quarters. Some knowledge changes how you see people, and not always in ways you expect. By morning, word of the rescue had spread through the station, and with it came a complication I had not anticipated. A member of my own delegation, Counselor Bren Yashkel, requested an urgent audience with me before the day's formal session began. Bren Yashkel was an older compact official, a man who had spent his career arguing that humanity's unpredictability made them dangerous allies, unsuitable for the kind of trust our civilization had never extended to any species before. He found me in my private quarters, his expression tight with something between alarm and vindication. "Princess, I trust you witnessed yesterday's events," he said, without any of the usual pleasantries our culture required before difficult conversations. "I did," I said carefully. "I witnessed 43 lives saved through remarkable coordination. I witnessed a single unelected, unranked human civilian command, an entire fleet, including vessels belonging to other human factions who had no obligation to obey him, through nothing but the sound of his voice," Bren said. "Princess, this is precisely the kind of danger I warned your father about. A species that grants this much unchecked authority to one person without formal process, without oversight, is a species capable of terrible things when that authority is misused." "He saved lives, Counselor. Compact lives, including your own niece's engineering cadet." That gave him pause, though only briefly. "And what happens the day someone like him decides not to save lives? What happens the day that authority is used against us instead of for us? I intend to raise this concern formally when the summit resumes. I believe the compact should reconsider the terms of this alliance until we understand exactly what kind of power structure we would be aligning ourselves with. I felt a flash of frustration, though I understood the roots of his concern were not without merit. Give me until this evening, counselor. I am meeting with Daniel Hale directly. Allow me to understand what I am dealing with before you bring this before the full council. He studied me for a long moment, weighing whether to trust my judgment against his own instincts. Until this evening, he agreed finally. But Princess, do not let admiration for one impressive rescue cloud what your duty to our people requires of you. His words followed me through the rest of the day, like a shadow I could not quite outrun. That evening, as promised, Daniel Hale met me in a small private room adjoining the summit chamber, away from the formal proceedings, away from the admirals and the counselors and the weight of official titles. He had changed out of the plain gray jacket into something equally plain, and he looked, if anything, more tired than he had the day before, as though the aftermath of the crisis had settled into his bones overnight. Walter Briggs was there as well, seated near the window, and I understood immediately that this was not a conversation Daniel intended to have alone. "Princess," Daniel said, gesturing for me to sit, "thank you for your patience. I imagine yesterday raised more questions than it answered." "It did," I said, "and I should tell you plainly, Mr. Hale, that a member of my own delegation intends to raise formal concerns about your authority before the Summit Council this evening. He believes what I witnessed yesterday represents a danger to any alliance between our peoples." Something like understanding, not surprise, crossed Daniel's face. "That is a reasonable concern to have," he said, which was not the response I had expected. "I would think less of your delegation if no one raised it." "Then help me answer it," I said. "Tell me what you truly are." Daniel glanced toward Walter Briggs, who gave a small nod, as though granting permission for something that had been discussed between them long before I arrived. "Walter told you about the Keeper," Daniel said, "about why the role exists. What he could not tell you, because it is not entirely his story to tell, is what it actually means to hold it, day to day, in a way that goes beyond history and explanation." "Then tell me," I said. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as though gathering the words from somewhere that cost him effort to reach. "When I was young," he began, "I was not remarkable in any way that mattered to anyone outside my own family. I did not excel in academy training. I was never singled out as a leader among my peers. I worked in logistics for 11 years, moving supplies between colony outposts, a job most people forget exists the moment they stop needing it done. I tell you this not out of false modesty, Princess, but because it matters to what I am about to explain." "Go on," I said. "The Keeper is not chosen for skill in command, or brilliance in strategy, or any of the qualities your people, or mine, typically associate with leadership," Daniel continued. "The Keeper is chosen through a process that looks instead for something much harder to measure. We look for someone who has spent their entire life demonstrating, in small, unremarkable ways, that they will put the well-being of others above their own advancement, even when no one is watching, even when there is nothing to be gained from it." "The maintenance worker," I said, remembering the moment I had witnessed in the corridor, the sincerity in his gratitude toward someone whose work most officers overlooked entirely. "That is not performance, Princess," Daniel said, something almost sad in his voice. "That is simply who I have always been, long before anyone considered giving me this responsibility. The selection committee, and it is a committee, not a single person, spends years, sometimes decades, quietly observing candidates across the entire human sphere, watching how they treat people who can do nothing for them in return. It sounds like an unusual way to choose someone who might one day command an entire fleet in a crisis. I know, but we learned, after everything we lost, that skill in strategy can be taught to almost anyone. Character, the kind that holds steady when someone screams at you to save yourself and leave a frightened cadet behind, cannot be taught nearly so easily." I thought of the moment on the command platform, the sharpness in his voice, when he had ordered Merrick to cut the harness and save them both, the softness that had followed when he told the engineer that no one was watching him be brave alone. Walter mentioned a war, I said. A failure of command that cost thousands of lives before the Keeper existed. We call it the fracture, Walter said quietly, speaking for the first time since I had entered the room. It is not a story we share easily with outsiders, Princess, and I ask that you treat it with the weight it deserves. An enemy fleet, one we are still not entirely certain of the origin of, attacked one of our earliest colony systems while our command structure argued over jurisdiction. Admirals debated with politicians over who held the authority to respond. For nearly 6 hours, while civilians died beneath an assault, none of them had the power to answer. By the time the argument resolved, there was very little left to save. After that, Daniel said, humanity made a choice. We decided that in a true emergency, hesitation born from bureaucracy would never again be allowed to cost us what it cost us that day. The Keeper exists to cut through exactly that kind of hesitation. Every officer who serves swears an oath, not to me personally, but to the role itself, to obey without question the moment a genuine crisis is declared, so that the argument that killed so many people can never happen again. And the salute, I said, it is not for you as a man, it is for what you represent. Yes, Daniel said, and there was real relief in his voice, as though he had been waiting for someone to understand that distinction without needing to be told twice. I promise you, Princess, there is nothing about me personally that deserves that kind of reverence. I am simply a man who was chosen to carry something much larger than myself, and I try, every single day, not to let that weight change who I was before anyone gave it to me. I sat with all of this for a long moment, feeling the shape of my understanding shift and resettle into something new. Counselor Yashko fears what happens if someone like you misuses that authority, I said finally. How does your civilization guard against that? The role is never permanent, Walter answered. The committee that selects the Keeper also watches for the moment the burden begins to change them, and when that moment comes, the role passes to someone new. It has happened before. It will happen again. Daniel has held it longer than almost anyone in our history, and if you ask him, he will tell you that worries him more than it reassures him. It does, Daniel admitted quietly. I did not ask for this to last as long as it has. I have watched good people hold this role before me, and I have watched what it can cost a person over enough years. I do not know how many more crises I have left in me before the committee decides it is time to find someone new, and truthfully, Princess, some days I hope that day comes sooner rather than later. There was no bitterness in his voice when he said it, only a tired honesty that struck me as far more convincing than any polished reassurance could have been. I will tell Counselor Yashko what you have told me, I said. I cannot promise it will be enough to satisfy his concerns entirely. Some fears are not so easily answered by explanation alone. I would not expect it to be, Daniel said. Trust is not built through a single conversation, Princess, no matter how honest. It is built through what happens the next time, and the time after that. I can only offer you my word that this authority has been used, every single time I have held it, to protect lives rather than to seize power. Whether that word is enough for your counsel is not something I can control. I rose to leave, my mind heavy with everything I had learned, but one final question stopped me at the door. May I ask you something else, Mr. Hale? Something less about the role and more about the man beneath it. He looked up at me, something curious and a little wary in his expression. You may ask, do you ever regret it, being chosen? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought perhaps he would not answer at all. Every day I do not lose someone I could have saved, he said finally. I do not regret it. Every day I do, I wonder if someone better than me might have found a way to save them anyway. I do not think that question ever fully goes away, Princess. I have simply learned to carry it alongside everything else. I left the room with far more understanding than I had entered with, and far more uncertainty as well, and I knew, walking back toward my own quarters through the quiet corridors of the station, that whatever recommendation I carried back to my father's court would need to account for both. Counselor Bren Yashkel listened to everything I told him with the careful, unreadable expression of a man who had spent decades learning not to reveal his thoughts before he was ready to. When I finished, he said nothing for a long time, simply staring out the small viewport in my quarters at the distant stars beyond the station. "A committee that watches for corruption and removes it when found," he said finally. "A role built specifically to avoid the failures of ambition. It is a thoughtful system, Princess. I will admit that much." "But," I said, hearing the word waiting behind his measured tone, "but it still relies entirely on human judgment to identify when that corruption begins," he said, "and judgment, however well-intentioned, is not infallible. I do not doubt that Daniel Hale believes every word he told you. I do not even doubt that he has, until now, used this authority exactly as he described. My concern has never truly been about him as an individual, Princess. My concern is about what this system reveals regarding how much humanity is willing to concentrate in a single point of failure, however carefully chosen that point may be." It was a fair concern, and I found myself without an easy answer to offer him. I had spent the last 4 days growing to understand the reasoning behind the Keeper's existence, but understanding a system was not the same as declaring it free of risk. "I do not ask you to abandon that concern, Counselor," I said instead. "I ask only that you allow me to see this through to its conclusion before you bring it before the full council. There is one more conversation I intend to have." He studied me for a long moment, and something in my expression must have convinced him, because he inclined his head slightly. "Very well, Princess. But the final session of this summit is tomorrow. Whatever conclusion you intend to reach, you will need to reach it before then." I found Daniel Hale again that night, not in the formal meeting room where we had spoken before, but in the observation lounge overlooking the docking bay, the same place where I had watched the Halcyon wing begin its final drift into destruction 2 days earlier. He stood alone at the viewport, a cup of the same burnt bean water in his hands, watching the quiet traffic of shuttles moving between the station and the ships docked around it. "You seem to find yourself in this room often," I said, coming to stand beside him. "It helps me think," he said. "There is something steadying about watching people go about ordinary business after everything that happened here. Reminds me why any of it matters." I studied his profile for a moment. This man, who had commanded an entire fleet with his voice alone, who had spent his early years moving supply crates between colony outposts, who apologized for being saluted and worried, quietly, that someone better than him might have saved more lives than he had. "I have one more question," I said, "the one I think matters most, before I return to my father's court tomorrow." "Ask it." "Why does it work?" I said. "I do not mean the history, or the selection process, or the oath the officers swear. I understand all of that now. I mean, why does it actually work, in the moment, when a fleet of 30 ships obeys the voice of a man with no rank, instantly, without hesitation? An oath is words on paper. Words can be broken. What makes those officers trust you enough, in the exact second it matters most, to act without question?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "I think you already know the answer, Princess," he said. "You watched it happen yourself, 2 days ago. Tell me anyway. I want to hear it in your words." "They do not obey me because of a title," he said. "They obey because every single admiral, every captain, every young officer on this station has watched, over years, the way this role has been used before their own eyes. They have seen it used to save lives, again and again, never once to seize power, never once for personal gain. Trust like that is not built through law, Princess. It is built through repetition, through consistency, through years of proof that outlasts any single crisis. The oath is not what makes them obey in the moment. The oath is simply the formal name we gave to something that was already true in their hearts, long before they ever swore it. I thought of my own people, of the rigid hierarchies my father's court had built over centuries, systems of rank and bloodline and formal succession that had never once considered choosing a leader based on how they treated a stranger who could offer them nothing in return. My people build authority through birth and formal appointment, I said. We do not have anything like this. Every civilization builds authority differently, Daniel said. I am not here to tell you our way is better than yours, princess. I am only telling you why ours works the way it does, because you asked, and because I think you deserve an honest answer more than a diplomatic one. Counselor Yashkal fears what happens the day it stops working, I said. The day someone chosen for this role decides their own judgment matters more than the lives they are meant to protect. He is right to fear that, Daniel said, surprising me with the readiness of his agreement. Every system built by people carries the risk of the people within it. I will not stand here and tell you this one is perfect, princess, because it is not. What I can tell you is that we built it with that exact fear in mind, and we have spent generations refining it, watching it, correcting it when it began to fail. It is not a guarantee. It is a promise, maintained through constant effort, and promises like that require more work to keep than most people realize. I looked out at the quiet traffic of shuttles moving between the ships, ordinary people going about ordinary lives, protected, in ways most of them likely never fully considered, by a system built from the wreckage of a catastrophe none of them had lived through themselves. I think I understand now, I said, what my father needs to hear. And what is that? That humanity cannot be measured the way my court has always measured other civilizations, I said slowly, feeling the shape of the thought solidify as I spoke it aloud for the first time. We look at fleet numbers, weapon strength, territory held when we decide whether another species is worth trusting as an ally, but none of that explains what I witnessed here. None of that explains why 30 ships changed course in seconds for a man with no rank, or why an entire station holds its breath around someone who eats breakfast alone and thanks maintenance workers by name. The true measure of your people is not in what you can destroy, Mr. Hale. It is in what you have built systems entire generations deep to protect. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, quiet and unguarded, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked less like a burden made flesh and more simply like a tired man who had heard, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that someone outside his own people finally understood what he carried. That is a kinder assessment than I expected, princess, he said. It is an honest one, I replied, which I have come to understand matters more to your people than kindness alone. The final session of the summit, the next morning, was unlike any diplomatic proceeding I had witnessed before. I stood before the assembled admirals, before Counselor Yashkal and the rest of my delegation, before Daniel Hale, seated quietly near the edge of the room, as he always did, and I gave my recommendation to the compact council, transmitted live across the vast distance to my father's own chambers. I came to this summit prepared to evaluate humanity through the same measures we have always used to judge potential allies, I said. Fleet strength, territorial reach, political stability. I found, instead, something I did not expect to find, and something I believe changes how this alliance should be understood. I told them of the rescue, of 30 ships responding instantly to a single voice, of 43 lives saved in the final seconds before catastrophe. I told them, carefully, of the Keeper, of the fracture that had shaped an entire civilization's understanding of what leadership should cost the person who holds it, and of a role built not to reward ambition, but to guard against it. Counselor Yashkal raises a fair concern, I continued, glancing toward him. That concentrated authority, however carefully built, carries inherent risk. I do not dismiss that concern, but I have come to believe that the presence of that risk, openly acknowledged and actively guarded against, generation after generation, speaks to something more trustworthy than the absence of risk we pretend exists within our own systems of inherited rule. Humanity did not build a perfect system. They built an honest one, willing to examine its own failures and correct them, even at great cost to themselves. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say settle fully into my chest. I recommend this alliance proceed, not despite what I witnessed here, but because of it. A species capable of building something like this, deliberately, painfully, from the wreckage of their own worst failure, is a species I believe we can trust to stand beside us, not simply as a fleet with impressive numbers, but as people who understand, in ways few civilizations ever truly learn, exactly what leadership should cost, and exactly who it should serve. There was a long silence after I finished, the kind that stretches uncomfortably before anyone finds the courage to break it. It was Admiral Carrington, finally, who rose from her seat and inclined her head toward me, a gesture of respect I had not expected from a woman who had saluted a quiet man in a gray jacket before she had ever acknowledged my own arrival. "Thank you, Princess," she said simply, "for seeing us clearly." Counselor Yashkal did not fully abandon his reservations that day, nor did I expect him to. Some caution, I had come to understand, was not weakness, but wisdom, the same careful watchfulness that had led humanity to build safeguards around their own greatest source of strength. But he did not oppose my recommendation before the council, and in the months that followed, as formal negotiations between our two peoples slowly began to take shape, I found myself returning, again and again, to that quiet observation lounge in my memory, to the sight of a man who apologized for being saluted, standing at a viewport, worrying aloud that someone better than himself might have saved more lives than he had. I never forgot the question that had started it all, the confusion that had gripped me the moment 3 admirals turned to salute a man in a plain gray jacket before acknowledging the arrival of a foreign princess. Who exactly is this human? I had wondered, certain the answer would be simple once I found it. The answer, when it finally came, was far larger than any single name could hold. It was a history of failure, transformed through generations of careful, deliberate effort into something worth saluting. It was a promise kept by people who understood, better than any civilization I had studied before them, that the truest measure of strength is not what you are willing to destroy, but what you are willing to build, and rebuild, and protect, long after the crisis that first demanded it has faded into memory. I returned to my father's court, forever changed by that understanding, carrying with me not simply a diplomatic recommendation, but a new and lasting respect for a species I had once believed I understood, and had, in truth, only just begun to see clearly for the very first time.